There is a number in the Gospels that almost everyone can recite, and almost no one has ever understood. 30 pieces of silver. 3 words, and even people who have never opened a Bible know what they mean. They have become a figure of speech, a shorthand for treachery, a phrase you can throw across a room without explaining it. 30 pieces of silver, the price of a betrayal. But almost nobody knows what that number actually was. Nobody tells you what those coins would have looked like in a man's hand, or what they could have bought, or where they came from, or why the priests chose that particular figure and not a rounder, larger, more impressive one. Nobody tells you that the amount was not invented in that room. It was quoted, it was lifted, deliberately and word for word, out of an old book of the law and an old book of the prophets, and every man in that chamber would have recognized it the moment it was spoken, and not one of them said a word about it. And here is the thing that will stay with you long after this letter is finished. When you find out what 30 pieces of silver was the standard price for, not a king, not a prophet, not a rabbi from Galilee, but something else entirely, you will understand that the amount was not merely low. It was a statement. It was a sentence spoken in the language of money. It was the chief priests of Israel, in the week of the Passover, quietly assigning to the Son of God a legal valuation that already existed on the books, and it was the most precise insult in the history of the world. They were not haggling. They were filing paperwork. And if you have ever been given a price, if someone once decided what you were worth, and the number came back smaller than you could bear, if you were traded away by a person who was supposed to keep you, if you have ever been made to feel like a line item in someone else's arrangement, then you need to hear what happened to those 30 coins, because the story does not end in that chamber. It ends in a field on the south side of Jerusalem, in ground too poor to farm, bought with money nobody would touch. And what that field was used for is one of the strangest mercies in all of Scripture. No one told you this, and the Father has something to say to you about it, about the price, and about the one who was priced, and about what your own name is finally worth in a ledger that was closed a long time ago in your favor. My child, a letter arrived for you. It was written long before you were born, and yet every line carries your name. This is a letter from the Father, and when the Father speaks, every word is Scripture. Settle now, wherever you are, in the chair you always choose, in the car, in the parking lot before you go in the kitchen with the light on over the sink and the house finally quiet. Wherever this letter has found you, stay there and let it be enough. You do not have to be a stronger version of yourself to hear this. You do not have to have your week in order, or your heart in order, or your history in order. This was written for exactly the person sitting where you are sitting, carrying exactly what you carried into the room. Before we go down into the story, and we are going a long way down into it, further than you have ever been taken with these 30 coins, I want to ask 2 small things of you, and then I will not interrupt you again until the end. The first is this. Tell me in the comments where in the world you are listening from. Just the place, a city, a country, a county, the name of the small town nobody outside of it has heard of. That is all. Because something happens in that comment section that I do not think you can picture until you scroll through it. There is someone reading this in Manila, and someone in Manchester. Someone in a hospital room in Ohio at 3 in the morning who cannot sleep. Someone in Lagos on a phone with a cracked screen. Someone in a village in the Philippines, someone in rural Kentucky, someone in Toronto, someone in Nairobi, someone in a flat in London with the rain coming down. And every one of them is holding something. Every one of them came to this letter with a weight. When you leave the name of your town, you are not leaving data. You are lighting a small lamp in a window so that the next person who comes along knows the road is inhabited. And the second thing, and I am asking this one sincerely, as plainly as I know how, if these letters have ever done anything for you, would you subscribe? It is free. It is one tap. But I want you to understand what it actually does, because it is not about a number on a screen. Every subscription is one more chair pulled up to a table that is already full of people who have carried grief quietly for years, who have believed for decades without ever saying the hard thing out loud, who come here because for 40 or 50 minutes somebody speaks to them as though they matter. That is what this is. It is a family scattered across the whole surface of the earth in 100 time zones, and you belong in it. Take the seat. It costs you nothing, and it means more than I can tell you. Now, the lamps are lit. Let us go to Jerusalem, to a room you have never been shown, in the week that changed everything. The price that was named out loud. The ache. There is a particular wound that only comes from being valued, not from being ignored. That is a different pain, and in some ways an easier one. Being ignored means nobody ever did the arithmetic. Being valued means somebody did. Somebody sat down, took the measure of you, weighed what you brought and what you cost, and arrived at a figure. And then they acted on it. You may know exactly when it happened to you. Most people who know this ache can name the moment. Perhaps it was a job. You gave that place years. You came in early for a decade. You covered for people. You learned the whole operation from the inside out. You carried the parts of it that nobody else wanted to carry and that nobody ever wrote down. And then, one afternoon, there was a meeting you were not in, and a spreadsheet you never saw, and a number in a cell next to your name. And the number did not justify keeping you. They were pleasant about it. They usually are. Somebody used the word restructuring, and you drove home understanding, for the first time in your life, that you had been a figure in a column the entire time, and that all those years of being early had never once been entered into the calculation. Perhaps it was a family. There was property, or there was money, or there was a house that had to be dealt with. And something came out of a relative's mouth during those weeks that you have not been able to unhear since. It revealed the rate. It revealed what you had been valued at in that family all along, and it was so much lower than you had assumed that it rearranged your memory of your own childhood. Perhaps it was a marriage. Somebody weighed a life with you against a life without you, and chose. And the terrible part was not the leaving. The terrible part was learning that a scale had been in the room, that you had been on one side of it, and that you had never known you were being weighed. Or perhaps, and this is the quietest version and the most common, it was never one event at all. It was an accumulation. It was 100 small signals over 40 years, none of which would sound like anything if you tried to describe it to someone. The way you were spoken over, the way your opinion was received and then quietly not used, the way certain people's plans included you as furniture rather than as a person. And somewhere along the way, you internalized a figure. You developed a private sense of your own market value, and it is low, and you have arranged your whole life around not testing it. That is the ache I want to name before we go one step further. Not the ache of being hated. Hatred at least grants you significance. This is the ache of having been priced, of discovering that you were an item in a transaction, and that the number was small, and that the people who set it did not even find it difficult. Now hold that, and walk with me into a stone chamber in Jerusalem 4 days before the Passover, and watch it happen to him. The story. The room would have been in the temple precincts, or in the palace of the high priest on the western hill, and either way, it would have been cool and quiet and expensive. Thick stone, small windows set high, the kind of room where the noise of the city arrives faint and far off, which is precisely what such rooms are built for. Outside, Jerusalem was filling up. Passover week swelled the population of that city several times over. Hundreds of thousands of pilgrims coming up the roads from Galilee and the coast, and Egypt and Babylon, camping on every hillside, driving lambs through the gates, packing the courts of the temple until you could hardly move. The whole city smelled of smoke and animals and dust and bread. And inside, the men responsible for all of it were having a problem. Matthew tells us they had already assembled. The chief priests, the scribes, the elders, the standing leadership of the nation, gathered in the palace of the high priest, whose name was Caiaphas. And they had reached a conclusion and hit a wall in the same breath. The conclusion was that the Galilean had to be removed. The wall was the crowd. Not on the feast day, they said, lest there be an uproar among the people. They were not moral men wrestling with a moral question. They were administrators managing a crowd control risk during the busiest week of the religious year. They needed him taken quietly, away from the multitudes at night, and they had no mechanism for doing it. And then the door opened. Matthew's sentence is one of the most chilling in the New Testament precisely because it is so flat. Then one of the 12, called Judas Iscariot, went unto the chief priests. One of the 12. Not a hostile outsider, not a planted informant, not an enemy who had been circling for months. One of the men who had been sent out 2 by 2 with authority to heal, one of the men who had eaten from the same dish, slept on the same floors, walked the same roads with the same dust on the same feet. One of the 12, who knew the schedule, who knew where they went at night, who knew the garden across the Kidron where he prayed, and knew that at that hour there would be no crowd there at all. He solved their entire problem by walking through a door. And then he said the sentence that this whole letter turns on. What will ye give me? And I will deliver him unto you. Stop there, because there is something in that question that most people read straight past. He did not name a figure. Consider what that means. He did not walk in and say, I want 1,000. He did not say, name me a sum worth a man's life. He asked an open question, what will ye give me? And in doing so, he handed the pricing to them. He left the valuation entirely in the hands of the chief priests of Israel, which means the number that comes next is not Judas's number. It is theirs. It is the considered judgment of the religious leadership of God's own people, given the freedom to set any figure they liked, with the treasury of the temple behind them and the most dangerous problem of their careers standing in front of them. And Matthew records what they did with that freedom in 5 words. And they covenanted with him for 30 pieces of silver. They had the whole temple treasury. This was the institution that had just been watching people pour money into the offering boxes all week. They could have named any sum. They could have made it 100, 500, 1,000. A sum that would have looked, to a later reader, like the price of something momentous. It would have cost them nothing to be generous. The money was not theirs. They said 30. And there is a detail in the Greek that makes this even more deliberate. The word Matthew uses does not simply mean they agreed to pay. It carries the sense of weighing out, of putting silver on a balance. That was an archaic way to handle money by the 1st century. Coins were counted, not weighed. They had been counted for centuries. So why does Matthew reach for the language of the scales? Because he is quoting. He is putting up a flag. He is telling every reader who knows the Scriptures that this exact scene, this exact figure, and this exact motion of weighing silver into a hand has happened once before in the Word of God, in a prophecy nobody in that chamber had the courage to mention. And maybe, as you listen, you are standing in that doorway with him, knowing what it is to have your worth handed over to people who were never qualified to set it, and to walk out with their number in your pocket. The Father's voice. And this is what the Father says to you, in his own words, and said unto them, What will ye give me? And I will deliver him unto you. And they covenanted with him for 30 pieces of silver. Matthew 26:15. But ye have despised the poor. Do not rich men oppress you, and draw you before the judgment seats? James 2:6. Since thou wast precious in my sight, thou hast been honorable, and I have loved thee. Therefore will I give men for thee, and people for thy life. Isaiah 43:4. Are not 2 sparrows sold for a farthing? And one of them shall not fall on the ground without your Father. But the very hairs of your head are all numbered. Fear ye not therefore, ye are of more value than many sparrows. Matthew 10:29-31. For thou hast possessed my reins, thou hast covered me in my mother's womb. I will praise thee, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Psalm 139:13-14. But God commendeth his love toward us, in that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. Romans 25:8. The seal. Did you hear it? Those were not my words. They never were. Set 2 sentences beside each other and let them stand there, because the distance between them is the whole gospel. They covenanted with him for 30 pieces of silver. Since thou wast precious in my sight, thou hast been honorable, and I have loved thee. Those are 2 valuations of the same universe, and one of them is binding, and the other one is not. Here is what I want you to see, and it is the point on which everything else in this letter will hang. The price the chief priest set that afternoon was real money. It genuinely changed hands. A man really did walk out of that room heavier by 30 coins, and it was, at the same time, completely and utterly wrong. It was not an estimate that came in a little low. It was not a fair figure arrived at with incomplete information. It was a valuation of the Son of God by men who had every religious credential in the nation, and not one particle of the necessary vision. And the number they produced was so far from the truth that it does not even qualify as a mistake. It qualifies as a revelation about them. Now bring that home, because this is why it was written down. Somebody priced you, and the number was real in the sense that it had consequences. It moved you out of a job, or out of a family's regard, or out of a marriage, or out of a seat at a table you had every right to sit at. The consequences were not imaginary, and I will not insult you by pretending they were. But the number was not true. Being priced by someone who cannot see is not the same as being worth what they said. The chief priests had access to more sacred information than any group of men alive. They had the scrolls. They had the lineage. They had the temple itself. And with all of it in their hands, they looked at the Lord of glory and wrote down the figure you would use for a piece of property. Credentials do not confer sight. Authority does not confer sight. Being your parent, your boss, your pastor, your husband, your wife, your church, does not confer sight. Only God sees, and God has published His valuation of you, and it did not come out in silver. He gave men for you. He gave people for your life. He gave His Son. So set something down before this movement closes. Not the memory. The memory is yours, and it is allowed to hurt. Set down the figure. The private, low, unspoken number you have been carrying since the day somebody handed it to you, the one you have been using ever since, as though it were an accurate reading of your soul. It was never accurate. It was never binding. It was a number produced by people who did not have the eyes for the job. The letter is not over. The Father has more to say. To you. The number that already existed in the law. The ache. There is a kind of insult that does not raise its voice. You have met it. It does not shout, it does not accuse, it does not even acknowledge that anything has occurred. It simply files you. It puts you in a category, and the category is beneath you. And the whole cruelty of it is that no one ever has to say anything out loud. The insult is in the paperwork. You have felt this in a waiting room where your name was mispronounced twice and then not used again. You have felt it in a hospital corridor where they spoke to the person beside you about you, in the third person, while you were sitting right there with your hearing perfectly intact. You have felt it in the tone certain people use for certain kinds of workers. The tone that is not rude exactly, but that has an unmistakable ceiling in it. You have felt it in a family that has quietly agreed which of the children is the capable one. And you were not it, and nobody ever announced this, and everybody has lived by it for 50 years. There is a particular grief in being categorized rather than confronted. If someone attacks you, at least they have engaged with you. If someone files you, they have decided you are not worth the engagement. Your worth was established somewhere in the back office, by a policy, and no human being ever had to look at you while it happened. And if you have lived long enough, you know the version of this that hurts most. Being categorized by the people who ought to have known better. Not by strangers, by the ones with access, by the ones who had all the information about who you actually were and used a form anyway. That is what happened in that chamber, and the form they used was 2,000 years old. The story. Go back with me, a long way back from Jerusalem in the spring of that year, back across more than 1,000 years, to a body of law given in a desert, to a slow, plain, practical section of the book of Exodus that deals with the ordinary disasters of an agricultural society. There is a passage there about oxen. It is not a passage anyone memorizes. It concerns what happens when an animal known to be dangerous gets loose and causes harm. If the ox was known to gore, and the owner had been warned and did nothing, and the ox killed a free man or woman, the case was extremely serious, and the owner himself could be liable with his life. That is the law of a society that takes human life with enormous seriousness. And then comes a further clause. If the ox shall push a manservant or a maidservant, he shall give unto their master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned. Read that once more slowly, because everything in this letter hinges on it. When the person killed was a bondservant, the case did not proceed as a matter of blood. It proceeded as a matter of compensation. The owner of the ox paid the owner of the servant, and the sum was fixed, and the sum was 30 shekels of silver. That is the number. That is where it comes from. It is not a round bargaining figure, and it is not a market rate that happened to be in the air that week. It is a statutory valuation out of the law of Moses, and every man in the room where Judas asked his question had known it by heart since he was a boy. Now understand what that figure actually represented, and be careful here, because this is where the knife goes in. It was not the price of a life. It was the price of a loss. It was not what a servant was worth as a human being made in the image of God. It was the compensation due to a third party for the destruction of something that belonged to him. The servant is not the injured party in the transaction. The servant is the item. The money does not go to his family. It goes to the owner. 30 shekels was the sum at which the law valued the inconvenience caused to a man by the death of another man he had a claim on. Compare it with the other valuations in the law, and the picture sharpens further. There is a chapter in Leviticus that sets out the amounts payable when a person is dedicated to the Lord by a vow, and then redeemed with money, a whole scale of values by age and sex. A man in his working prime is 50 shekels. A young man between 5 and 20 is 20. A woman in her prime is 30. These figures were about earning capacity and service, not about human dignity, but they establish the range that every Israelite carried in his head. 50 was a full-strength adult man. They valued the Son of God at less than they would have valued a laborer from their own village, and they did not choose 30 because it was random. They chose it because it was in the book. It is the settlement for damaged property. It is what you pay a man when his animal ruins another man's asset. In naming it, the leadership of Israel was not simply being cheap. They were making a legal statement in the only language their office understood. This one is not a prophet, and not a rabbi, and not a claimant to anything. This one is chattel. Assess him at the standard rate. There is a further irony in the coins themselves, and it is worth knowing, because it tells you what kind of week this was. The silver used for temple business in that period was almost certainly the Tyrian shekel, struck in the Phoenician city of Tyre, and famous throughout the region for the purity and consistency of its silver, which is precisely why the temple authorities insisted on it for the sacred half-shekel tax. It was the one coin trustworthy enough for the house of God, and it carried on its face the head of Melkart, the god of Tyre, whom the Greeks identified with Heracles, and on its reverse an eagle. Graven images, both sides, pagan coinage required by the temple, because the temple valued reliable weight above almost everything else. Those money changers Jesus had driven out of the courts a few days earlier were there in the first place to convert ordinary currency into precisely these coins. So, it is entirely possible, quietly, historically, without any need to press the point, that the silver counted into Judas's hand was the same silver the temple demanded from every worshiper, bearing the face of a foreign god, weighed out under the law's compensation clause for the loss of a servant. They paid for the lord of the temple in the temple's own currency at the slave rate. And maybe, as you listen, you know exactly what it is to be assessed at the standard rate by people who had every reason to know better. The Father's voice. And this is what the Father says to you, in his own words, "If the ox shall push a manservant or a maidservant, he shall give unto their master 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned." Exodus 21:32. But made himself of no reputation, and took upon him the form of a servant, and was made in the likeness of men. Philippians 2:7. He is despised and rejected of men, a man of sorrows, and acquainted with grief. And we hid, as it were, our faces from him. He was despised, and we esteemed him not. Isaiah 53:3. He came unto his own, and his own received him not. John 1:11. The stone which the builders refused is become the headstone of the corner. Psalm 118:22. Ye are bought with a price. Be not ye the servants of men. 1 Corinthians 7:23. The seal. Did you hear it? Those were not my words. They never were. There is something here that is almost too large to say quickly, so let me say it slowly. They assessed him at the price of a servant, and he had already, of his own free will, taken upon himself the form of a servant. Do you see it? Their insult was accurate. Not accurate about his worth. They could not have been more wrong about his worth, but accurate about the position he had chosen. They wrote down the servant's valuation for a man who had, before the world began, agreed to come into it as one. They meant it as a humiliation, and they were unknowingly filling out the correct form. Paul says it in Philippians in language that has never been improved upon. He made himself of no reputation. He emptied himself. He took the servant's form. He did not have that station forced upon him by the chief priests on a Wednesday afternoon. He had accepted it long before, and they were merely the last in a long line of people to confirm what he had already consented to be, which means the number tells you nothing about his value and everything about his descent. And here is why that matters to you, sitting where you are. The lowest valuation you have ever been given by another human being, he has already been given a lower one, not metaphorically, legally, on paper, in the currency of the temple. Whatever category you have been quietly filed into, he has been filed lower. Whatever ceiling somebody put over your life, he went underneath it on purpose, and he did it before you were born. So when you bring your humiliation to him, understand what you are bringing it to. You are not bringing it to a distant and dignified God who will need it explained. You are bringing it to someone who was assessed under the property clause. He knows the exact texture of what you are carrying, not because he is sympathetic, but because he has been there in the ledger with you. And notice the last verse the Father spoke over you. Ye are bought with a price. Be not ye the servants of men. There is a command hidden inside a comfort, because you have been purchased, and at what cost we have not even begun to speak of yet. You are not obliged to keep living under the valuation that men assigned you. You do not have to keep serving the number. You do not have to organize your 70s and 80s around a verdict that some tired manager or disappointed parent handed you decades ago. You have an owner, and it is not them, and he paid a great deal more than 30. So set something down before this movement closes. Set down the category, the quiet, unannounced classification that someone put you in and never told you about, and that you found out about by inference and have lived inside of ever since. It was a form. Forms are filled out by people who did not look up. The letter is not over. The Father has more to say to you. The prophet who was paid the same amount. The ache. There is a wound that belongs specifically to people who have given their lives to something, not to people who stood at a distance and criticized, to the ones who stayed, the ones who did the work, kept the books, opened the building, sat with the dying, drove the van, made the calls, covered the shift, held the family together through the years when it was genuinely difficult to hold. Those people carry a particular kind of injury when it comes, and it does not look like ordinary disappointment. It is the injury of having your service accepted and yourself dismissed. Perhaps you gave 30 years to a congregation. You were there before the current building. You cleaned it, you funded it, you taught the children of people who now run it. And there came a season, maybe with new leadership, maybe with a change in style, when it became clear that you were no longer regarded as an asset, but as an obstacle. Nobody said so. You were thanked warmly in a way that closed a door, and you went home and sat in the car in your own driveway for a while before you went inside. Perhaps you gave it to a company, or a farm, or a practice, or a family business that you kept alive through 2 recessions, and someone younger and more fluent explained to you kindly that things had moved on. Perhaps you gave it to people, to a child you raised alone, to a parent you nursed for 9 years while your siblings sent flowers at Christmas, to a spouse who was ill for a long time, or difficult for a long time, and to whom you were faithful in a way that nobody ever saw and that produced no monument of any kind. And what you carry now is not bitterness, exactly. It is something quieter and more corrosive than bitterness. It is the suspicion that the whole of it was assessed, at the end, at almost nothing, that if you added up what you gave and what came back, the ledger would be so unbalanced that it would be embarrassing to show anyone. There is a chapter in the Bible written for you. Almost nobody preaches it. It is one of the strangest passages in the prophets, and it contains our 30 pieces of silver, spoken 500 years before Judas was born. The story. The prophet Zechariah lived and worked in the years after the return from exile, when a broken remnant had come back to a ruined city and was trying to rebuild the house of God out of rubble and discouragement. He is a prophet full of visions, lampstands and horsemen, and flying scrolls and a man on a red horse among the myrtle trees. But in the 11th chapter, he does something different. He performs. God tells him to take up the instruments of a shepherd and to act out a parable in front of the nation. He is to become a shepherd to a flock, and the flock is described in terrible language, the flock of the slaughter, a people whose own owners buy and sell them and feel no guilt about it, whose own shepherds do not pity them. So Zechariah takes 2 staves. He names one beauty. The word carries the sense of graciousness, favor, delight, and he names the other bands, meaning the cords that bind, the union that holds a family together, and he shepherds them. And it goes badly. The shepherd works, the shepherd feeds them. And then comes a line so weary and so human that it stops you. My soul loathed them, and their soul also abhorred me. It went both ways. He grew sick of the work, and the people grew sick of the worker. Anyone who has stayed too long in a hard assignment knows both halves of that sentence and is ashamed of the first half. Then the staff called beauty is broken, the covenant of favor cut, and what happens next is one of the most devastating small moments in the Old Testament. The shepherd turns to the people and says, "If ye think good, give me my price, and if not, forbear." He asks them to name what his service was worth. He leaves it entirely open, exactly as Judas would leave it open in that chamber centuries later. Pay me what you think the shepherding was worth, or pay me nothing if you would rather. He puts his whole labor on the table and invites the assessment. And they weighed for my price 30 pieces of silver. They counted it out. The shepherd of God's people, sent by God himself, assessed and paid off at the compensation rate for a dead slave. And they did not do it in anger. That is the sting of it. They did it as a matter of ordinary business, and they probably thought themselves fair. And then God speaks, and his words drip with an irony so heavy it can hardly be lifted. And the Lord said unto me, Cast it unto the potter. A goodly price that I was prized at of them, a goodly price, a magnificent sum. Look what they valued me at. Notice, too, whose valuation it becomes in that sentence, not the prophet's, but the Lord's own. The price they set on the shepherd is a price they set on God, and the instruction is to throw the money away. Not to invest it, not to donate it, to cast it to the potter. And Zechariah does exactly that. I took the 30 pieces of silver and cast them to the potter in the house of the Lord. Read that clause again. In the house of the Lord. Silver thrown down in the temple. A potter. 30 pieces. And then, 500 years later, in the same city, on the same site, a man walks into the sanctuary and hurls 30 silver coins onto the stone floor, and the priests use them to buy a field from a potter. Every element already written down, nothing improvised. And maybe, as you listen, you are the shepherd standing there with the coins in your hand, having asked what your years were worth and been answered so precisely and so cheaply that you did not know what to say. The Father's voice. And this is what the Father says to you, in his own words. And I said unto them, If ye think good, give me my price, and if not, forbear. So they weighed for my price 30 pieces of silver. Zechariah 11:12. And the Lord said unto me, Cast it unto the potter, a goodly price that I was prized at of them. And I took the 30 pieces of silver, and cast them to the potter in the house of the Lord. Zechariah 11:13. Then was fulfilled that which was spoken by Jeremy the prophet, saying, And they took the 30 pieces of silver, the price of him that was valued, whom they of the children of Israel did value. Matthew 27:9. For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, saith the Lord. Isaiah 55:8. Declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times the things that are not yet done, saying, My counsel shall stand, and I will do all my pleasure. Isaiah 46:10. Therefore, my beloved brethren, be ye steadfast, unmovable, always abounding in the work of the Lord. Forasmuch as ye know that your labor is not in vain in the Lord. 1 Corinthians 15:58. The seal, did you hear it? Those were not my words. They never were. I want you to feel the weight of what has just been established, because it changes the entire emotional shape of that scene in the high priest's palace. The 30 pieces were not a low bid that God had to work around afterward. They were quoted from him, centuries earlier, in a performed parable that nobody could have understood at the time. The Lord himself put that figure into the record, attached it to a rejected shepherd, attached it to a potter, attached it to the floor of the temple, and left it lying there in a strange and difficult chapter that generations of readers have found obscure. Which means the men in that room were not driving the story. They were reciting it. They thought they were setting a price, and they were unknowingly quoting a prophecy. They believed they had authored an insult, and they had merely spoken a line that was written for them before their great-grandfathers were born. Nothing that happened to him that week was outside his Father's hands. Not the arrest, not the trial, not the mockery, and not the number. Now let that land on your own ledger. You have given years to something and been assessed cheaply for it. And the temptation, the real one, the one that visits at 4 a.m, is to conclude that the low valuation is the final accounting, that because the people you served produced a number that small, the number is the truth about your life. But look at what God said about the shepherd's 30. He did not say it was a fair price. He said with heavy irony, a goodly price that I was prized at of them. And then he told the prophet to throw it away. He did not tell him to accept it as a verdict. He told him to get rid of it. The money was not a measurement. It was an exhibit. It was evidence about the payers, and God preserved it as evidence for 500 years, and it stands to this day as testimony against them, and not against his servant. Your low valuation is evidence, too. It is on file. It is not your assessment. It is theirs, and it is being kept. And notice the last thing the Father said. Your labor is not in vain in the Lord. Not. Your labor will be recognized by the people you did it for. It very often will not be. But it is not in vain, because it was never actually being paid out of their treasury. There is another accounting, kept in another book, by someone who did not miss a single early morning, a single covered shift, a single night you sat up with someone who never thanked you. So set something down before this movement closes. Set down the ledger you have been keeping, the private tally of what you gave versus what came back, the one you take out and look at when you cannot sleep. You are not the accountant on this account. Hand the book to the one who has been keeping the real one all along, and let him show you the totals when the time comes. The letter is not over. The Father has more to say to you. The man who carried the bag. The ache. Nobody wakes up one morning and betrays everything they love. That is the first thing that has to be said, and it has to be said carefully, because the popular version of Judas, the cartoon version, the villain with the black heart, who was rotten from the day he was called, is not what the Gospels describe, and it lets all of us off far too easily. What the Gospels describe is a drift. You know what a drift is. It is not a decision. A decision has a date and a moment and a sense of gravity attached to it. A drift has none of those things. A drift is what happens when nothing in particular happens, over and over, for a long time. Think about your own life honestly for a moment, in the privacy where nobody can hear. There is a distance in you somewhere that opened up so gradually you cannot locate the day it began. Perhaps it is a distance from prayer. There was a time when you prayed with expectation, and now you say words at night out of habit and go to sleep before you finish. and there was no moment of unbelief in between, only 1,000 tired evenings. Perhaps it is a distance from a person. You did not fall out with your brother. You simply called less. Then it became awkward to call, and the awkwardness became its own reason. And now it has been 11 years, and neither of you could tell you how. Perhaps it is a compromise that began so small that naming it out loud would sound ridiculous. Something you started doing when nobody was looking. Something you began telling yourself was owed to you. A small dishonesty that became a habit of dishonesty. A private appetite that you have been feeding at a slightly increasing rate for so long that the current rate would have shocked the person you were at the start. That is the ache in this movement. And it is not the ache of a scandal. It is the ache of erosion. It is standing at the top of a road and looking back down it, and realizing that you cannot find the fork where you left the main way, because there was no fork. There was only a long, gentle, almost imperceptible bend, and it terrifies you, quietly, because if a man could arrive at that chamber by drifting, then the distance between an ordinary tired believer and a catastrophe may be much shorter than you were led to believe. The story. Let us look at what the record actually says about him, because it is more specific than most people realize. He was one of the 12. He was chosen. Luke tells us Jesus spent the whole night in prayer before naming the 12, which means Judas was not an oversight. He was appointed after a night of prayer. He was sent out with the others. When Jesus dispatched the 12 2 by 2, with power over unclean spirits and instructions to heal the sick and preach the kingdom, Judas went. There is no footnote saying he was excluded. He came back with the others from a mission trip that had worked. He was trusted with money. John tells us he had the bag, and the Greek word there is unexpectedly homely. It is glossokomon, a word that originally meant a case for the mouthpieces of flutes, and came in ordinary usage to mean a small box, a purse, the container in which a group of travelers kept their common funds. Somebody had to carry it. Somebody had to buy the bread, pay for the lodging, hand out the alms. That job was his, in a company that included at least 4 working fishermen and a former tax collector who was professionally numerate. The money was given to Judas. And John, writing 60 years later with everything settled and nothing left to protect, adds the sentence that tells you what had been happening in the quiet. This, he said, not that he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief and had the bag, and bare what was put therein. That verb, bear what was put therein, is doing something. It can mean simply to carry. It can also mean to carry off. John's readers would have felt both. He carried the bag, and he carried things out of it. Now, think about what that means practically, because it is the whole anatomy of a drift. Nobody is stealing the entire purse. That would be discovered in an afternoon. What is happening is small and slow. A coin unaccounted for. A price reported slightly high. A little arithmetic that no one is going to check, because he is the one who checks, and each individual instance is so minor that it would be absurd to call it a betrayal of the Son of God. It is a few pennies, and he has expenses, and he does the work nobody else wants to do, and the others do not appreciate the difficulty of managing a common fund with 13 men and no fixed income. That is how the road bends. Not with a decision, with a justification, repeated until it becomes furniture. And then comes the evening at Bethany, 6 days before the Passover, and the drift finally shows itself in the light. They are at supper in the house of Simon the leper. Lazarus is at the table, a man who had been dead, and Mary comes in with an alabaster flask of spikenard, a thick aromatic oil imported from the Himalayas along trade routes so long that the price is astronomical, and she breaks the neck of the flask and pours it out on him, and the house fills with the smell of it. And a voice comes out of the dark corner of the room. Why was not this ointment sold for 300 pence, and given to the poor? 300 pence. 300 denarii. A denarius was a day's wage for a laborer. So what Mary poured out that night represented roughly a year of a working man's income, minus Sabbaths and feasts. She emptied a year over his feet, and the man in the corner did the arithmetic out loud, and it sounded like compassion, and it was accounting. Hold the two numbers side by side, because they are the whole man. 300 pence for the ointment, 30 pieces of silver for the Lord. A year's wages, in his estimation, for a burial perfume. Roughly 4 months' wages, in the estimation he accepted a few days later, for the one it was poured on. He valued the container of the gesture 10 times more highly than the object of it. That is what a drift does to a man's eyes over 3 years. It does not make him blind. It makes him a precise valuer of the wrong things. And notice when the betrayal is set in motion. Matthew and Mark both place his visit to the chief priests immediately after that supper. The rebuke he received in that room, in front of everyone, over a woman's extravagance, is the last recorded thing before he went out to sell. And maybe, as you listen, you are standing in the corner of that room with the arithmetic already running, able to price everything in the house, and no longer able to see who is reclining at the center of it. The Father's voice. And this is what the Father says to you, in his own words. This he said, not that he cared for the poor, but because he was a thief and had the bag, and bare what was put therein. John 12:6. He that is faithful in that which is least is faithful also in much, and he that is unjust in the least is unjust also in much. Luke 16:10. Take us the foxes, the little foxes, that spoil the vines, for our vines have tender grapes. Song of Solomon 2:15. Keep thy heart with all diligence, for out of it are the issues of life. Proverbs 4:23. Search me, O God, and know my heart. Try me, and know my thoughts, and see if there be any wicked way in me, and lead me in the way everlasting. Psalm 139:23-24. Return unto me, for I have redeemed thee. Isaiah 44:22. The seal. Did you hear it? Those were not my words. They never were. Here is the mercy hidden in this movement, and you will not find it until you stop reading Judas as a monster and start reading him as a warning, written in a language you speak. He that is unjust in the least is unjust also in much. That sentence is usually preached as a threat. Hear it as a diagnosis instead, and it becomes something else entirely. It becomes useful. It tells you that the small thing is not small in its trajectory. It tells you that the private erosion you have been managing quietly for years is not a separate matter from the person you will be at 80. It is the same matter at an earlier stage, and that is not a sentence of doom. It is an invitation to intervene early, which is exactly what a father does for a child he intends to keep. Now, look at what God does not do in that verse from Isaiah. He does not say, "Come back to me," when you have cleaned up the arithmetic. He does not say, "Return to me, and I will consider redeeming you." He says, "Return unto me, for I have redeemed thee." The redemption is stated as accomplished, and it is given as the reason for coming back rather than the reward for it. You are not walking home to earn a welcome. You are walking home because the welcome has already been paid for and is sitting there getting cold. So here is what I want you to do, and it is very simple, and it will take you less than a minute. Name the small thing. Not the large one. The small one. The one that is so minor you have never once considered mentioning it to God, because it seemed beneath His attention. The coin out of the bag. The habit of the eyes. The exaggeration you always make in that one story. The extra drink you stopped counting. The thing you take that is not yours to take, whether it is money or time or sympathy or attention. Say it plainly in the room where you are, not as a confession of a monstrous crime. It is not one, as the naming of a bend in the road before the road bends further, because the terrible thing about Judas is not that he was uniquely evil. It is that for 3 years he looked exactly like the others. He sat at the same table. He was never suspected. When Jesus said, "One of you shall betray me," not one of them turned and looked at him. They all said, "Lord, is it I?" Which tells you that the drift is invisible from outside, and that the only person who can name it is you, and that today, in the quiet, is a good day to do it. Set down the justification. Just that. The sentence you have been using for years to make the small thing acceptable. You know the sentence. Set it down. The letter is not over. The Father has more to say to you. The kiss in the oil press. The ache. There is one betrayal that does not fit into any of the categories. You can survive being wronged by a stranger. You can survive being wronged by an enemy, because an enemy is honest about the arrangement. What breaks something structural in a person is being wronged with tenderness, being harmed by the specific gestures that were supposed to mean safety, the hand on your shoulder, the endearment, the particular way somebody said your name that nobody else has ever said it, the affection that was going on at the same time as the other thing, in the same room, from the same person, and that you now cannot separate from the injury, no matter how many years pass. Some of you know exactly what I am describing and have never told anyone. You know what it is to be told you are loved by someone who was, at that moment, already gone. You know what it is to find out later that during a particular season, a season you remember fondly, a season you have photographs from, something was being concealed the entire time, and every warm memory from those months now has a second layer under it that you cannot scrape off. You know what it is to be greeted affectionately by a person who has been talking about you. That is a specific and disorienting grief, because it does not only injure the present, it reaches backward and contaminates the past. It makes you distrust your own memory. You start reviewing years of ordinary happiness, looking for the seams. And it injures the future too, because after that, warmth itself becomes an object of suspicion. When someone is kind to you now, some part of you asks what it is for. If you have carried that, then you need to know that the Lord Jesus Christ was betrayed with a kiss, and that He saw it coming, and that He let the man do it, and that what he said to him while it was happening is one of the most astonishing sentences ever spoken by a human mouth. The story. They went out after the supper, down out of the city, through the Kidron Valley, and up onto the lower slope of the Mount of Olives to a walled plot of ground. Its name tells you what it was. Gethsemane comes from words meaning oil press. It was an olive grove with a press in it, a stone basin and a great weight, the apparatus by which the fruit of those trees was crushed until the oil ran out. Every day of the harvest in that place, good fruit was placed under a stone, and pressure was applied until what was inside it came out. He chose that garden to sweat in. It was Passover, which falls at the full moon, so the night was not dark. There would have been enough light through those old olive branches to see faces. It was cold. John mentions the servants making a fire in the courtyard later that same night. The city above them was awake and full. Hundreds of thousands of pilgrims, lamps in windows, and down here in the grove it was quiet enough to hear a man breathing. And he prayed until his sweat was as it were great drops of blood falling down to the ground. And his friends slept, and he came back 3 times and found them sleeping, and he did not rebuke them harshly. He said, "The spirit indeed is willing, but the flesh is weak." Even there, even then, he was making excuses for them, while his own soul was exceeding sorrowful, even unto death. And then the torches. They came down from the city with lanterns and torches and weapons, a detachment from the temple guard, servants of the high priest, officers with clubs, and Judas in front of them. He had given them a sign beforehand, and the practical reason for it is worth understanding. At night, in an olive grove, with a group of Galilean men who all dressed alike, the arresting party needed certainty. They could not afford to seize the wrong man and let the right one slip away over the wall in the confusion. So the sign was not theatrical, it was operational. "Whomsoever I shall kiss, that same is he. Hold him fast." He chose a kiss as the identifying mark. He could have pointed. He could have said the man on the left, the one who speaks first. He could have taken a step toward him and stepped back. Any of a dozen signals would have worked. He selected the gesture of a disciple's affection and respect for his rabbi, and he made it the instrument of the arrest. And Mark and Matthew both use a strengthened form of the verb. It is not merely that he kissed him. The word carries the sense of kissing warmly, fervently, repeatedly. He did not brush the arrest past him. He held on. And Jesus said, "And here you must slow down, because this is the sentence, 'Friend, wherefore art thou come?'" Friend. The Greek word is not the ordinary word for a beloved friend. It is heteros, which means comrade, companion, fellow. The word you would use for a man you have traveled with, worked alongside, shared a table and a road with. It is the word for someone who has been in the company, and Matthew uses that same word only 2 other times in his whole gospel, both in parables, both spoken to a man who is in the wrong and being addressed with terrible courtesy. So he does not say traitor, he does not say serpent, he does not say, "I know exactly what you have done and exactly what it cost." He says, "Comrade, companion, man I have walked with, what have you come for?" Luke records another line, "Judas, betrayest thou the Son of Man with a kiss?" He uses his name in the torchlight at the moment of arrest, with the temple guard closing in around him. He addresses the man by name and asks him a question. which is what you do to a person, you are still treating as a person, and not as an instrument." And then he turned to the crowd and asked whom they sought. And when they said, "Jesus of Nazareth," he said, "I am he." And they went backward and fell to the ground. And when Peter drew a sword and took off a man's ear, he healed the ear of the man who had come to arrest him. The last miracle before the cross was performed on a member of the arresting party. And maybe, as you listen, you can feel the exact place on your own cheek where somebody's affection and somebody's abandonment arrived in the same motion. The Father's voice. And this is what the Father says to you, in his own words. "And Jesus said unto him, Friend, wherefore art thou come? Then came they, and laid hands on Jesus, and took him." Matthew 26:50. "But Jesus said unto him, Judas, betrayest thou the Son of Man with a kiss?" Luke 22:48. "Yea, mine own familiar friend in whom I trusted, which did eat of my bread, hath lifted up his heel against me." Psalm 41:9. "For it was not an enemy that reproached me, then I could have borne it. Neither was it he that hated me that did magnify himself against me. Then I would have hid myself from him. But it was thou, a man mine equal, my guide, and mine acquaintance." Psalm 55:12-13. "Faithful are the wounds of a friend, but the kisses of an enemy are deceitful." Proverbs 27:6. "For we have not an high priest which cannot be touched with the feeling of our infirmities, but was in all points tempted like as we are, yet without sin." Hebrews 4:15. The seal. Did you hear it? Those were not my words. They never were. Look at the 55th Psalm again, because David wrote it 1,000 years earlier, and it reads like a transcript of something you have lived through. It was not an enemy. Then I could have borne it. Do you hear how modern that is? Not, I would not have minded. He says he could have carried it. An enemy's hatred is a weight a person can pick up and walk with. He is saying that this other thing, this betrayal from inside the circle, is a different category of load altogether, and that the difference is not in the size of the injury, but in its location. It comes in through a door that was left unlocked on purpose, because you unlocked it, because that is what love does with doors. And God put that psalm in the Bible. He did not correct David for feeling it. He did not tell him that a spiritual man would have processed it more quickly. He let the complaint stand in the sacred text for 3,000 years, so that you, tonight, in that room, would know that the specific grief you have never described to anyone has a page in the Word of God with your handwriting on it. Now look at what he called Judas. Friend. I want to be careful here, because this is not a sentimental point, and it is not a suggestion that the betrayal was fine. It was not fine. Jesus had said earlier, that same evening, that it would have been better for that man if he had not been born. There is no minimizing in the Gospels, and there will be none here. But at the moment of the arrest, with the torches on his face, he did not surrender his own character to what was being done to him. That is the thing to see. Judas's treachery did not succeed in making Jesus into someone smaller. The betrayal did not get to write the last line of his personality. He met a kiss of treason with the language of companionship and a man's own name, and he went to the cross without having become bitter in the 70 paces between the garden gate and the guard. That is what is offered to you. Not amnesia. Not a requirement that you pretend the kiss did not happen, or that you have no memory of the season it happened in. But the possibility that the person who did it does not get to determine who you become. That is the freedom hiding inside this scene. A betrayal is an event that happened to you. Bitterness is a person you turn into. The second one is not compulsory, and he has walked the road ahead of you to prove it. So set something down before this movement closes. Set down the second layer, the contamination that has crept backward over your good memories from that season, the suspicion that nothing in those years was real. Some of it was real. The warmth that was genuine is still genuine. Another person's later choice does not have retroactive power over what actually was. Let God keep the true parts. He was there for those too. The letter is not over. The Father has more to say. To you, the silver on the temple floor. The ache. There is a moment that comes to almost everyone eventually, and there is no good name for it in English. It is the moment when the thing you did stops being an idea and becomes a fact. Before that moment, there is a strange insulation. You know what you have done, but you have not yet fully arrived at it. There is still a haze of reasons around it, a fog of it wasn't like that, and they don't understand the situation, and anyone would have. And then something happens. A phone call, a look on a face, a consequence that lands, and the fog burns off in about 4 seconds, and you are standing in front of what you actually did with nothing between you and it. Some of you know the precise hour that happened to you. You could tell me the room. And what makes it unbearable is not the guilt by itself. It is the guilt combined with the impossibility, because in that same instant you understand that it cannot be taken back, not adjusted, not improved, not paid off. The words were said in front of the children, and they are in the children. The letter was sent, the money is gone. The years are spent. The person is dead, and the thing you needed to say to them is still, and will forever be, unsaid. And then comes the part nobody warns you about, which is that you will try to give it back. That is the instinct. Undo it. Return the item. Reverse the transaction. You go to the person, and you try to hand them the apology, and the apology bounces off. You go to your family, and you try to explain, and the explanation makes it worse. You go, sometimes, to a church, and this is the part that has broken more people than anyone admits. And you try to bring the real thing, the actual thing, to somebody in religious authority, and they cannot hold it, or they will not, and you leave the building with it still in your hands, and now with the added knowledge that there is nowhere to take it. That is the ache of this movement, not sin. Every movement of every letter deals with sin. This is the specific ache of remorse with nowhere to go. And it is exactly what happened on the temple floor. The story. Matthew alone tells us this, and he tells it quickly, the way you tell something you would rather not linger on. It is morning. The trial has moved. Jesus has been bound and delivered to Pontius Pilate, and Judas, who has apparently been somewhere in the city all night with the coins on him, learns that he is condemned. Then Judas, which had betrayed him, when he saw that he was condemned, repented himself. Now, there is a word in that verse doing enormous work, and English hides it. The word Matthew uses is metamelomai. It means to be seized with regret, to be sorry afterward, to have your feelings reverse. It is a word about the emotions. There's another word in the New Testament, the word used everywhere else for the repentance that leads to life. That word is metanoeo, and it means to change the mind, to turn, to take a different road, to go back to God. Matthew does not use that one here. He uses the first one. And that distinction is not a technicality. It is the difference between two men that same weekend. Because Peter also failed that night, publicly and repeatedly and with cursing, and Peter also felt the full weight of it. He went out and wept bitterly. The feeling was not the difference between them. Both men were devastated. Both men would have given anything to undo it. The difference was the direction they turned when the devastation came. Judas turned toward the institution. Watch what he does. He goes back to the chief priests and elders, the same men, possibly the same room, and he brings the money and he makes a confession that is theologically flawless. I have sinned in that I have betrayed the innocent blood. There is nothing wrong with that sentence. It names the act. It takes personal responsibility. It correctly declares Jesus innocent, which, incidentally, makes Judas one of the very few people in that whole passion narrative to state the truth out loud, and he states it to the very men who needed to hear it, at the very hour they were pressing for the execution. And they say to him, "What is that to us? See thou to that." Read that answer twice, because it is one of the coldest sentences in the Bible. What is that to us? Your guilt is not our department. We have what we needed. The transaction is complete, and the returns window is closed. See thou to that. It is your problem. Handle it yourself. Go away. Those men were the appointed mediators between God and the people. Their entire office, the robes, the incense, the altar, the blood, the whole apparatus of the temple standing above them as they spoke, existed for exactly one purpose: to receive guilty men and deal with their guilt before God. A man came to them with a confession of sin in his mouth and money in his hand on the eve of the Passover, and the priesthood of Israel told him it was not their concern. The system was standing right there, fully staffed, in session, and it had nothing whatsoever for him. And so he threw the money. And Matthew's detail here is precise and easy to miss. He cast down the pieces of silver in the temple. The word is naos, not the outer courts, where the crowds and the traders and the Gentiles could go, but the sanctuary building itself, the holy place, where no one but a priest had any business being. Picture it: a man forcing his way past whatever stood between him and the sanctuary, and hurling 30 coins onto the stone so that they rang and scattered and rolled, in the one place on earth where God had said his name would dwell. It is the act of a man throwing his guilt at heaven, because no one on earth would take it. And then he went and hanged himself. And maybe, as you listen, you know that particular walk out of a building, the one you take when you have brought the true thing to the people who were supposed to be able to receive it, and they handed it back. The Father's voice. And this is what the Father says to you, in his own words, saying, "I have sinned in that I have betrayed the innocent blood." And they said, "What is that to us? See thou to that." Matthew 27:4. And he cast down the pieces of silver in the temple, and departed. Matthew 27:5. For godly sorrow worketh repentance to salvation, not to be repented of, but the sorrow of the world worketh death. 2 Corinthians 7:10. A broken and a contrite heart, O God, thou wilt not despise. Psalm 51:17. If we confess our sins, he is faithful and just to forgive us our sins and to cleanse us from all unrighteousness. 1 John 1:9. All that the Father giveth me shall come to me, and him that cometh to me I will in no wise cast out. John 6:37. The seal, did you hear it? Those were not my words. They never were. Set the two sentences beside each other, because in the whole of Scripture there may be no sharper contrast than this one. What is that to us? See thou to that. Him that cometh to me I will in no wise cast out. That is the priesthood of men, and that is the priest. Now, I want to say something plainly, and I want to say it carefully, because it will matter enormously to somebody reading this. The tragedy of Judas is not that his sin was too large. The Scripture never says that. The tragedy is the address. He took a real confession to men who had no power to absolve, received the answer that such men always eventually give, concluded from their coldness that this was God's answer too, and acted on that conclusion. But those men were not God. Their refusal was not heaven's refusal. The bench they were sitting on was not the bench. And if somewhere in your history you took the true thing to a church, or a leader, or a person you had every right to expect better from, and they told you in one way or another that it was not their department, hear this: that was them. It was not him. You have been reading a human coldness as a divine verdict for years, and it was never a divine verdict. It was a tired man in an office who did not know what to do with what you were holding. There is a priest who does know, and he is not embarrassed by what you brought, and he will not hand it back, and he will not ask you to see to it yourself, because seeing to it yourself is precisely what he came to make unnecessary. Look at the direction of the two verbs in that last verse, him that cometh. I will in no wise cast out. All that is required of you in that sentence is arrival, not repair, not presentation, not a version of the story that makes you look better. Arrival. And notice one more thing, because it is the deepest mercy in this whole movement. Peter's failure was not smaller than Judas's. It was public. It was repeated 3 times, and it was garnished with oaths. And a few weeks later, on a beach, over a fire of coals, Jesus asked him 3 questions and gave him back his whole life and his whole commission. That is what would have been waiting on the other side of Friday. The road was open. It always was. He simply did not walk it, because the men in the chamber convinced him it was closed. So set something down before this movement closes. Set down the answer you got from the wrong door. It was never the Father's answer. Take the same thing you took to them, the real thing, unedited, with nothing softened, and take it to him tonight. He is on duty. He has never once, in the whole history of the world, told anyone that it was not his department. The letter is not over. The Father has more to say to you. The price of blood. The ache. There is a way of being religious that is enormously careful about small things and completely blind about enormous ones. You have met it. If you have spent any length of time inside church life, you have met it, and it may be one of the reasons some of you carry a wound that has never quite healed. It is the church that had a long and heated meeting about the color of the carpet, in the same season that a family in the congregation quietly fell apart, and nobody visited them. It is the committee that could not be moved on a point of procedure, and could not be moved to go and see the widow either. It is the relative who is scrupulous, genuinely scrupulous, about 100 details of practice, and who has not spoken to their own brother in 9 years, and does not consider this a spiritual issue. And here is why I raise it, because I am not interested in giving anyone a stick to beat the church with. I raise it because you may have been on the receiving end of it, and it may have cost you something you have never gotten back. Perhaps you were the one who was corrected precisely on a small matter, in a season when your life was coming apart, and no one asked about the larger thing. Perhaps you were the young person whose questions were treated as a discipline problem. Perhaps you were the divorced woman who was handled correctly and never once held. Perhaps you sat in a room where the rule was applied to you with great accuracy by people who never inquired what was happening in your house. That is the ache in this movement, the strange coldness of people who are meticulous about the letter and unmoved by the blood. And there is no clearer example of it in all of Scripture than what the chief priests did in the 10 minutes after Judas walked out. The story. The coins are on the floor of the sanctuary. The man is gone, and the chief priests do something so revealing that Matthew records it without a single word of commentary. Because none is needed, they pick the money up, and then they have a discussion about it. And the chief priests took the silver pieces and said, "It is not lawful for to put them into the treasury, because it is the price of blood." Understand what is happening. The temple had a treasury, the korbanas, the sacred fund, into which offerings were placed, and out of which the operations of the house of God were financed. And there were rules, drawn from Deuteronomy, about what kind of money could go into it. Money earned by certain means was regarded as unclean and could not be devoted to God. The priests, examining the coins in their hands, correctly identified a legal difficulty. It is the price of blood. That is their own phrase. They said it out loud. They knew exactly what the money was, and they named it accurately, and they were entirely right. Now, hold the whole scene in your head at once. These are men who, within the hour, will decline to enter the judgment hall of the Roman governor, because entering a Gentile building would defile them and prevent them from eating the Passover. They will stand outside in the courtyard, ceremonially unpolluted, while inside the building, an innocent man they have paid for is being scourged at their request. They will not put blood money in the offering box. They will pay blood money out of the offering box. They will not defile the treasury with the price. They will defile their hands with the purchase. They are, at that moment, standing in the house of God, holding the fee for the execution of the Son of God, and their concern is the accounting classification of the funds. And the solution they arrive at is a masterpiece of administration. They took counsel, Matthew says, they held a meeting, and bought with them the potter's field, to bury strangers in. They found a use that was charitable enough to be defensible, disposed of a problematic asset, and produced a public benefit. If you had audited them that afternoon, the books would have been clean. There is a sentence Jesus had spoken about these very men in that very temple only days before, and it lands here with terrible precision. Ye blind guides, which strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. The image is a domestic one. Wine and water were strained through cloth to remove insects, because the tiniest unclean creature would defile the drink. And he says, "You filter the cup with enormous care, and then you swallow the largest unclean animal in the country whole, and do not notice it going down." They strained the coins. They swallowed the crucifixion. And maybe, as you listen, you are recognizing a room you sat in once, where everything was done correctly and nothing was done rightly. The Father's voice. And this is what the Father says to you, in his own words. And the chief priests took the silver pieces and said, "It is not lawful for to put them into the treasury, because it is the price of blood." Matthew 27:6. Ye blind guides, which strain at a gnat and swallow a camel. Matthew 23:24. Woe unto you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites! For ye pay tithe of mint and anise and cummin, and have omitted the weightier matters of the law, judgment, mercy, and faith. These ought ye to have done, and not to leave the other undone. Matthew 23:23. For I desired mercy, and not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. Hosea 6:6. He hath showed thee, O man, what is good. And what doth the Lord require of thee, but to do justly, and to love mercy, and to walk humbly with thy God? Micah 6:8. Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Matthew 11:28. The seal. Did you hear it? Those were not my words. They never were. I want to draw out something in that verse from Matthew 23 that almost every reader skips, and it is important because this movement could easily be misused. He says they ought to have attended to the weightier matters, judgment, mercy, and faith. And then he adds 5 words that most people never quote, and not to leave the other undone. He does not abolish the small faithfulness. He does not say that the careful people should stop being careful. He says the scale is out. He says a man can tithe his garden herbs and neglect mercy, and that the answer is not to stop tithing, but to stop neglecting. So this is not permission to despise the meticulous, and it is not permission to despise the church. It is an instruction about weight. Now bring it home to the place where it actually costs something. Where in your own life has the scale gone out? There is a version of this in every one of us, and it is rarely dramatic. It is the man who is precise about his giving and has not asked his son a real question in 4 years. It is the woman who has never missed a service and cannot make herself go and see her sister. It is the household that is careful about what it watches, and careless about how it speaks to one another at the table. We are all, every one of us, capable of straining the cup with great attention while something very large goes down unnoticed. And here is the mercy in it. The Lord who diagnosed this was not standing over those men to destroy them. He was in that city, that week, to be the sacrifice that made the whole apparatus of straining unnecessary. He was not saying, "Be more scrupulous." He was saying, "I desired mercy," and he was on his way to become it. Which means the answer to a life that has gone out of balance is not a stricter accounting. It is not more filtering. The answer is, "Come unto me, all ye that labor and are heavy laden." The invitation is addressed precisely to the exhausted. And religious carefulness is one of the most exhausting labors a human being can undertake, because it never finishes and it never absolves. So set something down before this movement closes. Set down the strainer, just for tonight. Set down the fine mesh you have been holding over your own life and over everyone else's, and ask the Father one honest question in the quiet. Not what am I doing wrong, but where has my weight gone wrong, and let Him answer you gently, because that is the only way He answers people who ask that question sincerely. The letter is not over. The Father has more to say to you. The field nobody wanted. The ache. Some of you have never had a place. I do not mean a house. Many of you have had houses. I mean the thing underneath a house, the sense of belonging somewhere by right, of having ground under you that is yours, of being from a place that would claim you back if you turned up. Some people were born into that and have never once had to think about it. And some of you have spent an entire lifetime being, in some quiet sense, a guest. Perhaps you were the child who moved 11 times. New school, new accent to hide, new set of rules to work out by watching, and you learned to be pleasant and useful and slightly provisional everywhere you went. And you are 70 now, and you still do it, in every room you enter. Perhaps you left a country, and you know the strange homelessness of the immigrant that no one back home understands and no one here can see, that you are foreign in the new place and have become slightly foreign in the old one too, and there is now no country on earth where you are entirely from. Perhaps it happened inside your own family. There was a home, and you were in it, and you were somehow never of it. The others had a language you never quite spoke, and your whole life at every gathering you have been the one standing slightly to the side of the photograph. Or perhaps it happened in the church. You were in a fellowship for years, and you were welcome, and you were never quite included. You were on the rota and never in the confidences, and you cannot even complain about it, because nothing was ever done to you. That ache has an old name. Scripture calls it being a stranger, and there is a field on the south side of Jerusalem, bought with the money that was paid for the blood of Christ, and I want you to hear what it was used for, because I do not think anyone has ever told you. The story, they took counsel, and they bought the potter's field, to bury strangers in. Let us take that apart slowly, because every clause in it matters. A potter's field. Potters needed clay, and clay comes out of the ground, and the ground they dug it from became over the years useless for anything else. It was pitted, stripped, heavy, sour. You could not farm it. You could not grow vines on it. Once the potters had finished with a plot, what remained was a piece of land with no agricultural value whatsoever, which is exactly why it would have been cheap enough to buy with 4 months' wages in an expensive city at the busiest week of the year. They bought waste ground. That is the only kind of ground that money could buy. Tradition has long located it in the valley of Hinnom, on the southern edge of Jerusalem, the ravine that runs below the city, which had its own long and dreadful history. It was in that valley, in the worst years of the kings, that children had been burned in the fires of Moloch at a place called Topheth. Jeremiah had stood at its gate and pronounced judgment on it. Its name in Greek, Gehenna, became the standard word for hell. It was the valley of what a nation throws away, and in that valley they bought a scarred piece of exhausted clay pit with the price of Christ. Now, the last clause, to bury strangers in. Understand the practical problem it solved. Jerusalem at Passover was flooded with pilgrims from Alexandria, from Rome, from Babylon, from Asia Minor and Greece and the coastal cities, hundreds of thousands of them, many elderly, many having traveled for weeks on foot or by sea to reach the city before they died, because to die in Jerusalem was a mercy. And some of them did die there. Some of them died in the streets and the lodging houses and the encampments on the hillsides, far from any family plot, with no relatives in the city, no tomb, no one whose duty it was to see to them. In that culture, that was a horror. A man's grave was his last belonging. To be buried with your fathers was the final proof that you were somebody's. To die unclaimed and unburied among strangers was the loneliest end available to a human being. So the field was bought as a burial ground for people who had nobody. Not for the priests, not for prominent men, not for citizens of Jerusalem, who had their own family tombs cut into the rock north and east of the city. For foreigners, for the unclaimed, for the ones who arrived from somewhere far away and did not make it home. Sit with that, because it is one of the strangest mercies in all of Scripture. The money paid for the betrayal of Jesus Christ bought a plot of ground where people who belonged to no one on earth would be laid in the ground and covered. The priests did it for administrative convenience. They were disposing of an awkward asset, and what they built with it, without the faintest idea of what they were doing, was a resting place for outsiders, purchased with the price of the one who was himself about to die outside the city, outside the gate, unclaimed by his own nation, and buried in a borrowed tomb that was not his either. And the people of Jerusalem gave it a name, not the priest's name for it, the people's, Akeldama, the field of blood. And Matthew, writing decades later, notes that it was called that unto this day, which tells you the name stuck, and that everyone in that city knew what the ground had cost. And maybe, as you listen, you are one of the strangers, and this is the first time anyone has told you that ground was purchased with you in mind. The Father's voice, and this is what the Father says to you, in his own words. And they took counsel, and bought with them the potter's field, to bury strangers in. Wherefore that field was called the field of blood unto this day. Matthew 27:7-8. Wherefore Jesus also, that he might sanctify the people with his own blood, suffered without the gate. Hebrews 13:12. Now, therefore, ye are no more strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints, and of the household of God. Ephesians 2:19. He raiseth up the poor out of the dust, and lifteth up the beggar from the dunghill, to set them among princes, and to make them inherit the throne of glory. 1 Samuel 2:8. God setteth the solitary in families. Psalm 68:6. In my Father's house are many mansions. If it were not so, I would have told you. I go to prepare a place for you. John 14:2. The seal. Did you hear it? Those were not my words. They never were. Watch what God does with the money. Men set a price to destroy a man. Men handled the coins with distaste. Men held a meeting and disposed of the funds in the most convenient available manner. And when the accounts had all been settled and the paperwork was clean, what stood on the ground as a result of that entire wicked transaction was a place for people with nowhere to go. He did not stop them from paying. He did not stop them from buying. He let the whole thing proceed, and he wrote the ending himself, and the ending was a grave for strangers. That is what your God does with the money that was paid to destroy things. Now take it further, because Hebrews already has. He suffered without the gate. He died outside the city, outside the walls, outside the sanctioned space, in the place where the unclean and the condemned and the rubbish went. The Son of God was executed in the district of the excluded, and Hebrews says that this was the point, that he might sanctify the people with his own blood. He went out to where the outsiders were and made that ground holy. And then Ephesians finishes the sentence over you. Ye are no more strangers and foreigners, but fellow citizens with the saints, and of the household of God. Do you see how completely that answers the ache you brought into this movement? You have lived on the edge of the photograph. You have been in the room and not of it. You have been the guest at every table for 70 years, and have half stopped expecting anything else. And the Word of God says no more, not tolerated, not accommodated, not gratefully permitted to remain. Fellow citizens, with full standing, full rights, full belonging, and of the household, which is not a civic word at all, but a domestic one. Family, not the man at the door, the one who has a chair at the table because of who he is, not because of what he contributes, and the ground for it was bought. That is the point of this whole strange episode. Long before you were born, in the ugliest transaction in human history, at the price of a servant, in a valley named for what a city throws away, a field was purchased where the unclaimed would be laid down and covered. It was a shadow. It was a small, dark rehearsal of something enormous, because a place was being prepared for you too, by the same blood at the same hour, and he said so out loud the night before. I go to prepare a place for you. So set something down before this movement closes. Set down the provisional posture, the habit of standing slightly to the side, the apology you have been quietly making with your body for 50 years for taking up a seat. You have been given a place, and it was not given to you on sufferance, and it was not cheap. The letter is not over. The Father has more to say to you. The potter's house, the ache. There is a particular despair that belongs to people who believe they are past repair, not people who think they have done wrong. Everyone thinks that. This is different and much heavier. It is the settled conviction that something in you was damaged at a stage so early, or broken in a way so structural, that whatever else God may do with you, He is now working around a defect, rather than with a whole person. You may have thought it in these words: I am not ruined enough to be a testimony, and not sound enough to be useful. Perhaps it came from your beginning. You were formed in a house where something was wrong, and by the time you were old enough to know that, the shape had already been set. And you have spent 50 years managing the consequences of decisions made about you before you could speak. Perhaps it came from a decade you cannot get back. There was a period, a bad marriage, an addiction, a business that consumed you, a stretch of years where you were simply absent. And you came out of it eventually, but the years did not come out with you. Your children's childhoods happened during that period. Your parents died during it. And you can be forgiven for it. You believe that, but you cannot be given the decade back. And so the forgiveness sits oddly on you, like a coat that fits nowhere. Perhaps it is simply your temperament, something in the wiring, the anxiety that has never left, the darkness that arrives in November, the anger that lives closer to the surface in you than it does in other people. And you have prayed about it since you were 25, and it has not changed. And you have quietly concluded that this is a manufacturing fault, and that God is being very gracious about it. Now, I want to take you to a workshop, because God once sent a prophet to watch a craftsman work, and what he saw there is the answer to every sentence you have just read. The story. The word came to Jeremiah with an unusual instruction, not a message to deliver, an errand to run. Arise and go down to the potter's house, and there I will cause thee to hear my words. So he went, down through the streets of Jerusalem, probably toward the southern part of the city near the water and the clay, to the shops of the potters, noisy, dusty places, the smell of wet earth and the smoke of kilns. And he stood and watched a man work. The wheel in that period was 2 stones on a shaft, a heavy lower wheel that the potter kicked with his foot to keep the momentum going, and an upper wheel where the clay sat. The work is done at speed, wet-handed, with continuous pressure, and the whole thing depends on the clay being centered. If there is a stone in it, or an air pocket, or a stiffness in one part, the vessel will pull off true as it rises. And Jeremiah watched that happen. The vessel that he made of clay was marred in the hand of the potter. There's the word, marred, spoiled, ruined, gone wrong under his hands. Now watch what the potter does, because the whole prophecy is in this one motion. He does not throw the clay out the door. He does not sweep it off the wheel into the street. He does not set it aside as a failed piece and reach for fresh material. So he made it again another vessel, as seemed good to the potter to make it. He collapses it. He presses the whole ruined shape back down into a lump, which must have looked, to anyone passing, like destruction. Everything that had been achieved is gone. The height is gone. The wall is gone. The opening is gone. It is just wet earth on a wheel again. And then he starts the wheel, and he makes it again. Same clay, same hands, new vessel. And God says to the prophet, in the noise of that workshop, O house of Israel, cannot I do with you as this potter? Behold, as the clay is in the potter's hand, so are ye in mine hand. Now, there is a second potter's scene in Jeremiah, and you should know about it, because the 2 together tell the whole truth, and one without the other becomes sentimental. A chapter later, God sends him out again, this time to buy a finished earthen bottle, and carry it out to the valley of Hinnom, to the gate by the potsherd gate, and to break it in front of the elders. And the word he gives with it is severe. Even so will I break this people and this city, as one breaketh a potter's vessel, that cannot be made whole again. There is the difference, and it is everything. Soft clay on the wheel can be remade any number of times. Hard, fired clay can only be shattered. What determines which one you are is not how badly the vessel has gone wrong. It is whether you are still pliable in his hands. And there is one more thing about that prophet and that valley that must be said here, because it is the hinge of this entire letter. Later in his life, with the Babylonian army camped around Jerusalem and the city days from falling, God told Jeremiah to buy a field in Anathoth, in a country about to be occupied, from a cousin, for 17 shekels of silver, weighed out, there is that word again, and witnessed and sealed and placed in an earthen vessel for long keeping. A prophet buying real estate in a doomed country. And God's explanation was this: houses and fields and vineyards shall be possessed again in this land. The purchase was a prophecy. It said, this ground has a future that you cannot see from here. And maybe, as you listen, you are the clay collapsing on the wheel, sure that what is happening to you is the end of the piece, when it is the beginning of the second making. The Father's voice. And this is what the Father says to you, in his own words. And the vessel that he made of clay was marred in the hand of the potter. So he made it again another vessel, as seemed good to the potter to make it. Jeremiah 18:4. Behold, as the clay is in the potter's hand, so are ye in mine hand, O house of Israel. Jeremiah 18:6. But now, O Lord, thou art our Father, We are the clay, and thou art potter, and we all are the work of thy hand. Isaiah 64:8. For thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, Houses and fields and vineyards shall be possessed again in this land. Jeremiah 32:15. Being confident of this very thing, that he which hath begun a good work in you will perform it until the day of Jesus Christ. Philippians 1:6. And he that sat upon the throne said, Behold, I make all things new. Revelation 21:5. The seal. Did you hear it? Those were not my words. They never were. Now, put the pieces of this letter together, because they have been converging on this point for a long time, and you may not have seen it coming. A prophet is told to throw 30 pieces of silver to the potter in the house of the Lord. A traitor throws 30 pieces of silver down in the sanctuary. The priests use them to buy a potter's field, the clay pit, the waste ground, the place where ruined material and broken vessels ended up, the very ground that supplied the workshop where God taught his prophet that marred things get made again. That is where the price of Christ came to rest. Do you see what your God has done? He has taken the ugliest sum of money in human history and used it to buy the ground where broken vessels are made again, and where strangers are laid to rest. And he arranged the entire thing through the hands of men who thought they were only tidying up their books. Now, bring that into the room where you are sitting. You said you were past repair. You said that whatever else God does with you, he is working around a defect. Here is the answer. And it is not a comfort I invented. It is a workshop the Father sent a man to stand in, so that it could be written down for you. He does not work around the defect. He collapses the vessel and makes it again. And I want to be honest with you about what that feels like, because you may be in it right now. The remaking does not feel like restoration while it is happening. It feels like loss. It feels like everything you had built coming down under a hand you cannot see. When a potter presses a marred vessel back into a lump, the clay, if clay could feel, would experience it as the end, not as the beginning of a better shape, as the destruction of the only shape it knew. The season that is undoing you may be the second making. And notice what the potter never does. He never changes the material. He does not go and get better clay. The vessel that comes off the wheel at the end of the day is made of exactly the same earth that failed in the morning. Which means God's plan for you was never to replace you with someone more promising. It is you he intends to have. Same clay. Same hands, new vessel, being confident of this very thing, that he which hath begun a good work in you will perform it. He will finish, not you. He finishes his own work, and he has never yet left a piece half made on a wheel and walked out of the shop. So set something down before this movement closes. Set down the word ruined. It is not a word you are qualified to use about your own life, because it is a verdict on a finished object, and you are not finished. You are on the wheel. The pressure you feel is not destruction. It is a hand. The letter is not over. The Father has more to say to you. The price he paid instead. The ache. There is one question underneath every ache in this letter, and we have circled it long enough. Let us say it plainly. What am I actually worth? Not what did I achieve. Not what do people say at gatherings. Worth. The figure. The one you privately believe is accurate about you, when there is nobody in the house, and nothing to distract you, and the honest number floats up. Most people never say it out loud, and there is a reason for that. To say it is to expose it, and once it is exposed, somebody might agree with it. So it stays down there, unexamined, quietly running everything. It decides what you will ask for. It decides whether you apply, whether you speak up, whether you believe a kindness or look for the motive behind it. It decides how you pray, because a person who believes he is of small value prays small prayers and apologizes for taking up the time. And if you are older, there is a further pressure on that number, and I want to name it because nobody else will. You are past the age at which a life is generally regarded as productive. There are fewer things you can point to now. The house is quieter. The calls are fewer. The world has a way of gently, politely, and continuously communicating to people over a certain age that the main body of their contribution is behind them, and that what remains is a kind of dignified waiting. And so the question sharpens. If my worth was in what I produced, and I no longer produce it, what am I now? There is an answer. It is not a compliment, and it is not encouragement. It is a price, a real one, actually paid, in a real transaction, and it is recorded, and it settles the question permanently. The story, go back for a moment to a pit in the wilderness of Dothan, 1,700 years before Jerusalem. A boy is in the bottom of a dry cistern. His brothers, who put him there, are sitting down to eat within earshot of him, and a caravan comes over the ridge, Ishmaelite traders, camels loaded with spices and balm and myrrh, on the road down to Egypt. And Judah, one of the brothers, says the sentence that has echoed ever since. What profit is it if we slay our brother and conceal his blood? Come, and let us sell him. So they sold Joseph for 20 pieces of silver. 20. Under the valuation scale in the law, 20 shekels is the standard figure for a male between 5 and 20 years old. They did not haggle him down out of spite. They simply took the going rate for a boy his age. He was priced accurately by the market, by his own family, and he went down into Egypt as an item of freight. And you know what happened. Slavery, then a false accusation, then a prison, then years of being forgotten by a man who had promised to remember him, and then a throne and a famine, and a moment when 10 frightened men stood in front of a governor they did not recognize. And when it was all finished, Joseph said this to them, "But as for you, ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive." 2 intentions running through the same event at the same time, in opposite directions. Theirs was real. His was realer. Now come forward to Jerusalem, and to a price of 30, because there was a second transaction that week, and this is the one nobody tells you about. And it is the reason this letter exists. While the priests were counting out silver in a stone room, God was preparing to pay a price of his own. And Peter, who had failed in that same courtyard, who knew as well as any man alive what a person is worth at the moment of their worst, wrote the 2 prices side by side 30 years later, and the sentence he produced is one of the summits of the New Testament. "Forasmuch as ye know that ye were not redeemed with corruptible things, as silver and gold, from your vain conversation received by tradition from your fathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish and without spot." Redeemed. It is a market word. It means bought out. the specific word used for purchasing a slave out of the market and setting him free. It assumes a price paid to obtain a person who was not free. And Peter says, "Not with silver, not with the metal in that room, not with the Tyrian shekels, not with the temple treasury, not with anything that can be weighed, counted, coined, inherited, or spent, corruptible things, things that tarnish, wear, get stolen, lose value, and eventually mean nothing to anybody, but with the precious blood of Christ. That is the counter price. That is what was actually paid for you. And it was paid at the same hour, in the same city, at the far end of the same week. And the two transactions have been sitting in the same chapter of history ever since, waiting for someone to hold them up beside each other. 30 pieces of silver to hand him over, the blood of the Son of God to bring you home. And there is one more picture, and it is the smallest parable Jesus ever told, and it is 2 sentences long. The kingdom of heaven is like unto treasure hid in a field, the which when a man hath found he hideth, and for joy thereof goeth, and selleth all that he hath, and buyeth that field. Everyone reads that as a parable about us. Find the kingdom, give up everything, get it. And that reading is not wrong. But turn it over. There is a man who found something he counted as treasure, and it was buried in a field, and it was in poor ground, and he went and sold everything he had, laid aside the glory he had with the Father before the world was, emptied himself, took the form of a servant, and he bought the field to get what was buried in it. The priests bought a field with the price of his blood. He bought a field with his blood to have you. And he did it for joy. That is what the verse says, for joy thereof, not grimly, not as a duty discharged. There is a sentence in Hebrews that says the same thing with the cross in view, who, for the joy that was set before him, endured the cross, despising the shame. You were the joy set before him. And maybe, as you listen, this is the first time in your long life that anyone has told you the actual figure. And it is not 30, and it never was. The Father's voice. And this is what the Father says to you, in his own words. Forasmuch as ye know that ye were not redeemed with corruptible things, as silver and gold, from your vain conversation received by tradition from your fathers, but with the precious blood of Christ, as of a lamb without blemish and without spot. 1 Peter 1:18-19. For ye are bought with a price. Therefore glorify God in your body and in your spirit, which are God's. 1 Corinthians 6:20. Again, the kingdom of heaven is like unto treasure hid in a field, the which when a man hath found he hideth, and for joy thereof goeth and selleth all that he hath, and buyeth that field. Matthew 13:44. Looking unto Jesus, the author and finisher of our faith, who for the joy that was set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and is set down at the right hand of the throne of God. Hebrews 12:2. But as for you, ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good, to bring to pass, as it is this day, to save much people alive. Genesis 50:20. Greater love hath no man than this, that a man lay down his life for his friends. John 15:13. The seal. Did you hear it? Those were not my words. They never were. Here is where the whole letter arrives, and I want to put it as simply as I know how. There are 2 prices on record concerning you, and only one of them was paid by someone who could see. The first price was set by people. Some of them were family. Some of them were employers. Some of them were the very people who were supposed to represent God to you, and did the worst job of it. They looked at you with partial information, mixed motives, and their own wounds in the way, and they arrived at a figure. And the figure was low, and it has followed you for decades. The second price was set by God, with complete information, including all of it, including the parts of your history that no human being knows, including the drift, including the thing you have never said out loud, including the years you cannot get back. He priced you knowing everything, and what he paid was not silver and gold. It was the blood of his own Son. Now, which of those two figures do you propose to organize the rest of your life around? Because that is the only question this letter has ever been asking. And notice something about the second price that makes it impossible to argue with. Value in every market on earth is finally established not by opinion, but by transaction. You can argue about what a thing is worth until the sale goes through. After that, the sale is the answer. The sale went through. It was completed on a Friday afternoon outside the walls of Jerusalem, and the receipt was 3 words long: "It is finished." And in the original that phrase, tetelestai, was the word written across a bill when the debt on it had been paid in full. It was the word for a settled account, which means your worth is not a matter of your feelings about yourself, and not a matter of anyone else's assessment, and not a matter of what you can still produce at your age. It is a matter of public record. It has been paid, the transaction cleared, and that is why Joseph's sentence is in your Bible. Ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good. The brothers really did sell him. It really was evil. And underneath their transaction, there was another one running the entire time, in the opposite direction, with a purpose they could not have guessed at, to save much people alive. Somebody sold you cheap. It happened, and it was wrong, and you did not imagine it. And underneath it, the whole time, running in the other direction, was a purchase that they knew nothing about, made by someone who paid everything he had for joy to have you. So set something down now, and let this be the one you actually do. Set down the number, not the memory of the person who gave it to you. That will take longer, and God is patient. Set down the figure itself. It has been operating in you as though it were true. It is not true. It has been outbid, permanently, publicly, and at a cost you will spend eternity understanding. You were not redeemed with corruptible things. And now, my child, let me gather the whole of it, and seal this letter. Take all of it with you, not as information. You have had enough information in your life. Take it the way you would take a folded letter out of a drawer on a bad evening, and read one line of it, and put it back. What will ye give me? The price was left to men who could not see, and their answer was a confession about themselves, and never a measurement of him. They covenanted with him for 30 pieces of silver. Somebody's number for you was real money and real consequences, and still entirely wrong. 30 shekels of silver, and the ox shall be stoned. He was filed under the property clause on purpose, so that there would be no category of humiliation you could ever enter that he had not already gone underneath. He made himself of no reputation. He did not have the low seat forced on him. He took it before you were born, on his way to you. If ye think good, give me my price, and if not, forbear. The shepherd asked what the years were worth, and was answered cheaply, and God kept the receipt as evidence, against them, never against him. A goodly price that I was prized at of them. Your low valuation is on file in heaven as an exhibit, not as a verdict. He was a thief and had the bag. Nobody arrives at a catastrophe in one step. Name the small thing tonight, while it is still small. 300 pence for the ointment, 30 for the Lord. A man can become a very precise valuer of all the wrong things, and never notice the day his eyes changed. Friend, wherefore art thou come? The kiss did not get to decide who he would be, and what was done to you does not get to decide who you become. It was not an enemy that reproached me. Then I could have borne it. Your particular grief is written down in the word of God, in the handwriting of a king, and it was never corrected out of the text. I have sinned in that I have betrayed the innocent blood. He brought the true thing to the wrong door and read a man's coldness as God's answer. It was not God's answer. It never was. What is that to us? See thou to that. That was the priesthood of men. There is a priest. Him that cometh to me, I will in no wise cast out. All that is required of you in that sentence is arrival. It is not lawful for to put them into the treasury. A person can strain the cup with enormous care and swallow a camel whole. Ask God about your weight, not your rules. To bury strangers in, the ugliest money in history bought a resting place for people who belonged to no one, and he was already outside the gate, buying you a place he had told you about the night before. Ye are no more strangers and foreigners. You may stop standing to the side of the photograph. You have full standing, and it was not given on sufferance. The vessel was marred in the hand of the potter, so he made it again. Same clay, same hands, new vessel. He does not go and get better material. Behold, as the clay is in the potter's hand, so are ye in mine hand. The pressure you are feeling is not the end of the piece. It is a hand. Houses and fields and vineyards shall be possessed again in this land. He buys ground in doomed places, because he can see what the ground will be. Ye thought evil against me, but God meant it unto good. Two intentions ran through the same event. Theirs was real. His was realer. Ye were not redeemed with corruptible things, as silver and gold. Whatever they weighed you at, it has been outbid. For joy thereof he goeth and selleth all that he hath, and buyeth that field. You were the joy set before him, not the duty, the joy. It is finished. A word written across a settled account. Your worth is now a matter of public record. Nothing in your circumstances may have changed in the time it took to hear this letter. The chair is the same chair. The room is the same room. The person who priced you cheaply is very likely still alive and still holding the same opinion, and may never revise it in this life. But something else may have moved underneath, the figure you have been using. It was never yours to accept. It was theirs to answer for. Before this letter is sealed, there are a few things I would ask of you, and then I will let you go. If these words have found you tonight, subscribe and stay with us. That is the first thing, and I ask it sincerely. It is free. It is one tap, and it keeps your place in this family. And turn the notifications on, because that is the only way you will actually know when the next letter arrives. Without it, these things quietly pass most people by, and if you would press like on this letter before you go, I would be grateful. Not for the number, but because a like is what carries the letter across the distance to someone else's chair, someone who has been living under a low valuation for 40 years and has never once been told it isn't binding. There is more coming, and I want you to have it. We are going to keep going down into the Scriptures exactly like this, unhurried, verse by verse, with the history and the languages and the ordinary human ache all held together. There are letters ahead on the words spoken from the cross, on the men who ran and the men who stayed, on the questions Jesus asked and never answered, on the parables that have been softened for so long that nobody feels their edges anymore. Long form, slow, and for people who have lived enough life to need the real thing. I would like you to be here for them and share this one. Somebody came into your mind while you were listening. It may have been during the field bought for strangers. It may have been when the vessel collapsed on the wheel. It may have been at the very beginning when we spoke about the meeting you were not in and the number in the cell beside your name. You know who it was. Send it to them. You do not need the right words. You have probably been looking for the right words for a long time. Hand them this letter instead. One message. This made me think of you. That is all it takes, and it can reach further than you will ever know. And now, the seal. May the God who was valued at the price of a servant tell you plainly this week what you are actually worth to him. May every verdict passed on you by someone who could not see be recognized for what it was, a figure produced by people who never looked up. May the small thing you named tonight stay named and stay small and be healed. May you take what you brought to the wrong door and bring it, at last, to the one who has never in the history of the world told a single soul that it was not his department. May you, who have stood at the edge of every photograph you were ever in, know yourself to be a fellow citizen and a member of the household, with your feet under the table by right. May the hand you feel on you in this pressing season turn out to be the hand of the potter and not the hand of the destroyer. And may the price that was paid for you, not silver, not gold, but the precious blood of the Lamb without blemish, settle the question of your value so completely that you never again organize a single day of your life around a number that somebody else made up. May you carry this letter with you, folded inside your heart, sealed by his promise. This was a letter from the Father. Every word he spoke was Scripture, and every word was for you. Until the next letter, you are loved, you are seen, and you are his.